Dwyer says that the team didn't see anything during its visits to suggest a lab accident. Quote, "Now, whether we were shown everything, you can never know. The group wasn't designed to go and do a forensic examination of lab practice."
The basic point for us here is there has to be some intermediate, right? This virus knows the trick of infecting humans extremely well, right? It is post-adaptation. Where that adaptation took place isn't pangolins, it doesn't appear. We don't have another candidate that has emerged. We don't have a human population in which it could have learned this. And so in some sense, the laboratories in Wuhan are one possible intermediate, right? They are not the only possible intermediate. And what Heather mentioned a few minutes ago, the WHO, in collaboration with China, appears to be steering us towards another hypothesis. I'm just going to give you one couple minutes from this interview between Becky Anderson of CNN and Peter Daszak of this WHO commission, who you will have heard us mention before. Okay, show the clip, Zach.
Well, we're talking about something very different right now than, a package of frozen fish from somewhere else in the world. We're talking about the origins of SARS-CoV-2, the COVID outbreak, in a market in Wuhan, the likely center of it, the early spreading of that outbreak. And what we see there when we visit that market is a place that sold a lot of frozen products, not just the typical things we would buy in a supermarket, but also frozen animal products from animal farms in Southeast Asia and inside China. And there's a really striking piece of evidence that was mentioned today in the press conference that in those products were included wildlife, meat, and carcasses from animals that we know are susceptible to coronaviruses, and also that the supply chains come from places in China where we know the SARS coronavirus 2 related viruses are. In other words, a direct link from the potential bat origins of this virus, which most scientists believe is true, into Wuhan market. Now, scientists in China tested those carcasses and they were negative. So that's good. But we don't know what else was there. We don't really know if there were live animals there. So there's no evidence of that, but we don't know. And we don't know how many of these animals were part of that frozen market or even other types of meat. So, to many of us on the team, it was a clear clue as to what may have happened. And it was one of the pathways that we thought was more likely than others, for sure.
Let me just be quite clear about this then. It's one of those pathways that might be more likely, you say, and that's an agreement that you made as a team. But I'm struggling to understand.
Say again? Keep going then.
Specific evidence that you have to support this contention, sir, with respect.
Well, the specific evidence comes from the work that China's been doing, that Chinese scientists have been doing from really day one of the outbreak. So around about January the 1st, scientists from China CDC went into the market and started swabbing the market. They looked at sewage, they looked at stalls where they sold food, they looked at the stalls where the people were positive for coronavirus. They spent about a month in there swabbing, testing, over 900 samples collected, a really thorough, deep study. Most of the animals' products had gone, but there were some still there. If there were live animals in the market, we think mainly aquatic animals, but we don't know. There is rumors of live mammals in that market. But what was really intriguing was this find of carcasses of animals, mammals, actually ferret-badgers, which are a type of animal that's widely eaten across Southeast Asia, which we know has the capacity.
All right, so that was Peter Daszak, and we will put a link to that that little interview in the description of this video. You should check out the whole thing. It's rather incoherent. What I believe is not said anywhere is that Peter Daszak, they say he's a zoologist on the WHO team. Peter Daszak is more than a zoologist. He is also head of EcoHealth Alliance, which has been deeply involved in the funding pathway for gain-of-function research, including sending millions of dollars to Wuhan to study these very viruses. So he has an intense conflict of interest. But go ahead.
The description of him as a zoologist across all of the major media platforms, whenever they mention him, is beginning to feel intentionally misleading. It is true that he's a zoologist, and that describes his training from many decades ago. But what his work has been, the way that he has made a living for all of his recent history, is as president of an organization that specifically works on gain-of-function research on coronaviruses, on bats, and works with the Wuhan Institute.
So, to be clear, we are not looking to blame anybody for the COVID-19 pandemic. There is fault, we believe, in at least the recklessness of the gain-of-function research, which, if it didn't cause this outbreak, certainly could cause a very serious outbreak. So there is something about this that requires our scrutiny. But at some level, what we have here is a failure to appreciate the hazard of gain-of-function research, and that's a hazard. That's a failure on the part of the international scientific community. So the point, though, is Daszak has the strong incentive to favor any hypothesis other than a lab leak. And so the fact that he's on the WHO team, I believe he's the only American on the WHO team, really raises the question about what sort of investigation this is. But the key here is that you can see Daszak is very excited about the possibility, what he says is evidence of another pathway, basically that there were frozen ferret-badger steaks in the Wuhan seafood market. And the reason that this is exciting to Daszak and others on the WHO team is that ferret-badgers are mustelids, which are another creature which SARS-CoV-2 can infect. So we have seen, unlike the case with pangolins, to which SARS-CoV-2 is not well adapted, SARS-CoV-2 is also not well adapted to bats, but it has spread like wildfire through mink farms. So minks are mustelids, and the virus not only infects minks, we've seen it infect other things like big cats in zoos, but what it does not do is spread from them. And the case in minks is exceptional. So minks actually catch the disease and they spread it very much like humans. It's well adapted to people. It's well adapted to minks. And ferret badgers is a small clade of closely related creatures in Southeast Asia.
Allow me to just do a tiny bit of phylogenetic description here. So this from one of the tomes of mammals. It's a little dated at this point, but this is the second volume of Walker's Mammals of the World, the one that includes the carnivora, which is one clade. Within the carnivora we have, as you have said, the mustelids, which includes, broadly speaking, the weasels, ermine, stoats, minks, ferrets, and polecats. And then also within the mustelid is the genus Melogale, which the common name for which is ferret badger. So that's not a misspeaking. It's neither a ferret nor a badger, although it is closely related to a ferret. And this is true across a lot of common names, right? That you end up with, like, I don't know what it is. I'm going to kind of call it both things. And
but both ferrets and badgers are mustelids. So it is one of the rare cases where these two things show up in the right clade. So,
yeah, spotted skunks. Anyway, it's a cool clade.
Skunks have been moved out of the mustelids, not meaningfully, but
including
since
the spotted skunks,
I believe so.
Okay, so I just had a couple of sentences to read from Walker's here about the ferret badgers. Also, at the point that this book was published in the 90s, we thought there were 3 species. Now we think there are 5. This is a splitter-lumper distinction that is not of much interest to anyone outside of the people doing this work. Certainly of very little interest to the ferret badgers themselves, actually. The ferret badgers are found in wooded country and grassland. They climb on occasion. Ferret badgers are savage and fearless when provoked or pressed and have an offensive odor. And a ferret badger, so the diet is omnivorous and is known to include small vertebrates, insects, earthworms, and fruit. And a ferret badger is sometimes welcome to enter a native hut because of its destruction of insect pests. So welcome in the places where they live, which is, as you say, sort of broadly throughout Southeast Asia.
So a couple things to say. One, Peter Daszak reports that these things are widely eaten. I don't know how widely they are eaten. Apparently, you found evidence that they are eaten by some people.
Yeah, I think, let's see, the IUCN Red List, if I can find it here. So the IUCN being the, what does it stand for? Why isn't it on the page? I don't know. The IUCN Red List did suggest that the one very widely distributed species, which is the only one that is in China, including within the range of Wuhan, does get eaten sometimes, but this is a long.
Okay.
A long page.
So this is the Chinese ferret badger.
Yeah.
Okay. So the point is, so let's put Peter Daszak's motives aside. Peter Daszak, for whatever reason, does not find the lab leak hypothesis credible and has in fact portrayed us and other people as conspiracy theorists for even considering it. But really the point is we need an intermediate. The lab would be one obvious intermediate. In fact, the use of mustelids in the lab is likely. Ferrets would have been a possible creature in which serial passaging might have been done, which would very well explain why this is so easily infecting and spreading between minks. We don't know that to be the case, but it's possible. But in any case, the fact that it spreads in mustelids means that if they can find a mustelid link, that, okay, in principle, there could have been an epidemic of the ancestor of SARS-CoV-2 in ferret badgers in, let's say, some other part of China or some other place where they exist. And then he proposes that that in fact there was ferret badger meat in the Wuhan market. He says it was tested negative, which is good. I don't know why he regards that as good. This virus came from somewhere, and this would be as good an answer as any if it was true. So anyway, the link would be the frozen ferret badger steaks having come from infected animals where the function of infecting human cells was gained in this intermediate, resulted in the transportation of the virus to Wuhan, where it then infected somebody in the market or infected somebody who took a steak home from there. Now, this is highly unlikely. For one thing, we would have to imagine if that was the expected route, then it would have been effectively SARS-CoV-2 that came off that steak, because if it wasn't, then there would have been an evolutionary phase in Wuhan for which we have no evidence. So it effectively has to have already done all of that evolving at the point that it arrives in Wuhan on the steak. And what we know is that these viruses don't transmit effectively this way. It's not to say some viruses couldn't, and it's not to say it's completely impossible, but the idea that this came off of a frozen steak is pretty unlikely given how overwhelming the transmission by airborne and aerosolized particles seems to be of this virus. So in any case, this does have the sense of the WHO team grasping at straws. They don't want to look at the lab leak hypothesis, for which the evidence has gotten stronger and stronger. It's not a settled question, but it is stronger. And they do want anything else that could take the place of that missing link in the logical chain. And so they are now putting, one way to say this is frozen ferret badger steaks are the new pangolins.
All right. So just to wrap that up a tiny bit more, Zach, if you would show my screen just for a minute. 3 days ago on February 10th, Nature published in their news section, major stones unturned. COVID origin search must continue after WHO report, say scientists. Investigation team rules out idea that the coronavirus came from a laboratory leak, but offers two hypotheses popular in Chinese media. Well, that sub-headline actually is not an accurate portrayal of what's in the piece. Zach, if I might have my screen back here, I'm just going to read from 2 paragraphs lower down in that report. Quote, another focus of the WHO's investigation was the idea that the virus leaked from a lab, a scenario that the team found unlikely. Incidentally, unlikely and rules out are not the same. Peter Ben Emberich, a food safety and zoonoses scientist with the WHO in Geneva, Switzerland, who headed the investigation, said at the press conference that the team had conducted extensive discussions with staff at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has been at the center of the speculation, and similar labs nearby. He said a leak is unlikely because the virus is not known to scientists before December 2019. Dwyer, that's a medical virologist at New South Wales Health Pathology in Sydney, also a member of the WHO team. Dwyer says, again, still quoting from this Nature News article from February 10th about the WHO report, Dwyer says that the team didn't see anything during its visits to suggest a lab accident. Quote, now, whether we were shown everything, you can never know. The group wasn't designed to go and do a forensic examination of lab practice. End quote. May be true. If so, why not? How is it that they were going in order to actually contemplate all and assess all of the hypotheses on the table, of which there is considerable evidence pointing to the idea of a lab leak, if they were not actually ready to, wasn't designed to go and do a forensic examination of lab practice? Who then is?
And so what effectively this does is it conflates an absence of evidence. Well, we weren't equipped to do that investigation.
And the people who were there say it didn't happen.
Right. Now, I will say, were it the case that this virus did not emerge from that laboratory, you would have the people in the laboratory virtually certain that this had not been on their watch.
They would sound the same way they do, which is part of why you can't look at them and say, listen to how they sound, that's evidence. They would sound the same either way.
Well, they would sound the same, and I believe the strong implication is that they would behave very, very differently. Now, nobody knows what goes on inside, internal Chinese government discussions of these things. But the fact is the behavior of the laboratory has been incredibly suspicious. It has been the opposite of transparent. And under normal conditions, you would imagine that were you to run such a lab, Zhang Li herself says that when this virus first emerged, she didn't get a wink of sleep for fear that it had escaped from her lab, right? And then she reports, it didn't, and therefore I, relaxed. But the point is, she considered it plausible, right? Were you to find yourself in this situation where you knew that it didn't come from your lab because you'd never seen that sequence before, it's out in the world, it's doing trillions of dollars of damage to the world economy and killing millions of human beings, you would be very inclined to show your books and say, didn't come from here, take a look, right? Even if that wouldn't be your normal impulse, because everything is riding on this question, including the future of this lab. So the idea that they would want to keep, so in any case, what they did was delete a major database which would have likely contained evidence. They haven't shown notebooks. They haven't opened their freezers. The WHO Commission says lab leak very unlikely, but of course we're not in a position really to have done that forensic work, right?
And the spokesperson from the WHO team, not the leader of it, but the main media spokesperson, Darling, is directly tied and funding the research that was being done in that lab.
Right. So in any case, all of this again raises the specter of, can we just please have an open investigation, every hypothesis on the table, including frozen ferret-badger steaks? That's a hypothesis. But at this moment, what that is a hypothesis with no evidence. The sum total of the evidence for that hypothesis is ferret-badger steaks were apparently present and tested negative, right?
I don't know why. I'm sure that Daszak wasn't thinking this, but whenever you say frozen ferret-badger steaks, I imagine one with a stick. I imagine actually a frozen ferret-badger popsicle. And, maybe you're more inclined, more likely to get the virus by licking a slowly thawing frozen ferret-badger popsicle than you would be by frying it up and
I think
or maybe you do both, actually. Maybe you lick the frozen ferret-badger popsicle until it thaws, and then you fry it, and then you eat it.
Still, I think it's unlikely to transmit that way. I think you would have to you would have to shave it and make particles, which you sort of
aerosolized frozen ferret-badger steak popsicles.
Yeah, or snow cones.
No, I mean, actually, that sounds pretty parsimonious to me.
Yeah. The whole thing is rather remarkable. But hey, we've got a number of did it evolve somewhere else, that's a hypothesis, right? It's a hypothesis that involves a train. It makes a prediction. There's a population somewhere else that had an epidemic that we haven't found yet, in spite of the fact that
the entire world is looking.
Like,
right? We're all looking.
Right.
Yes.
Did it start in ferret badgers who were then transported maybe live? Maybe that's what happened. Live to the Wuhan seafood market, and they coughed on somebody, and we have no evidence of it.
Ferret badgers coughed.
Could be.
Presumably before being turned into ferret badger popsicles.
Well, here's the thing. They've got the frozen steaks. You and I regard the likelihood of frozen steaks as pretty low because this stuff
the likelihood of them having passed this on.
Having passed it on that way. But there were also live animals in the market. He waffles over whether or not there were any live ferret badgers. But nonetheless, let's say, okay, the hypothesis that it was ferret badgers in some other part of China, that is a viable hypothesis, right? What does it predict? It predicts a population of ferret badgers who, A, probably are still circulating this virus. We should be able to find them, right? B, will show, immunity to it. In other words, we'll be able to see that they have antibodies to this very thing. So in any case, we could probably come up with a dozen predictions from that hypothesis. Well, let's go to it. That's a hypothesis on the list, but so is the lab, right? So anyway, that's how all of this should be dealt with. We're looking for a missing link. We should all agree on that. That missing link can be anything from a laboratory to a population of mustelids, and all of these things make predictions. That's the nature of a hypothesis. And a proper investigation would simply sort through these things. And at the end of the day, we would very likely get the answer. But we're not going to get it by saying, there's no evidence for that hypothesis. Why is there no evidence? Because we didn't look for evidence. Okay, that's not.
Well, to the degree that we looked for evidence, we asked the people who would have the most to lose if that hypothesis were true, and they said it isn't true. And so we said, okay, we trust them. Don't you trust them? How dare you not trust them? What are you, xenophobic?
Yes.
Come on.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Good. Well, I think we covered the topic. I
do too.
Hopefully that makes it clearer why the discussion is moving in the direction it's moving and what is really at stake in the various claims.